It's my pleasure to be offering the Dharma talk this morning. The topic of my talk this morning has the unwieldy title, "If Nothing is What It Appears to Be, Then Anything is Possible." This talk was prompted by watching the four-part series that recently aired on PBS entitled The Fabric of the Cosmos, which was based on the book of that title by the physicist Brian Greene. I've seldom been so impressed by a TV series as I was by this one. To call it mind-altering or mind-blowing would be an understatement, and if any of you watched it, I think you understand what I mean. Most of us who are not scientists do not keep up with what's going on in physics, and especially with the more contemporary quantum physics. It all seems very technical and esoteric. It's like those physicists live on another planet and speak a language which we just don't understand. And what Greene has achieved both in his book and in the TV series, I think, is to explain some of these concepts in terms that the layperson can at least begin to understand. Though I must admit that my brain was left swimming with questions, confusion, and wonderment at the end of each of the four broadcasts. So be aware that whatever I describe here as what I understand Greene to be saying is a terribly oversimplified version from one who is scientifically challenged. Nonetheless, I want to take a stab at it because I found it so very compelling and relevant. One of the first things that struck me about what physicists today are saying about time, space, and the universe is how compatible so many of these theories are with what is taught in Buddhism. The idea that nothing is what it appears to be, which is the first thing that jumps out at you when you watch The Fabric of the Cosmos. And in my understanding, that's one of the central tenets of Buddhist teaching. In the Heart Sutra, we chant, "Form does not differ from emptiness. Emptiness does not differ from form. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. The same is true of feelings, perceptions, impulses, consciousness." Now, those are words that all of us have chanted many times, and for me, those words have always expressed a paradox and a mystery which I don't begin to understand or comprehend. But they make just a little more sense to me, or at least I can see a context for understanding them after watching The Fabric of the Cosmos. And let me explain. The first of the four Cosmos episodes is about space. What is space? Now, this is something I think we tend to take for granted. We tend to equate space with emptiness or nothingness. We know that the air around us contains certain gases, primarily oxygen, but also carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and so forth, and sometimes dust particles. But otherwise, it's just empty. Right? This space between you and me, this air is just empty. And in space, outer space, where there's no oxygen, it's just a vacuum, right? No, wrong. It's not what it appears to be, or perhaps not to be. According to Greene and other physicists, this all begins, or rather began, with the Big Bang, which led to the creation of the universe. According to this theory, which is almost universally accepted by physicists today, some 13.7 billion years ago, whatever existed in its original form, which may have been as tiny as a pencil point, or possibly as large as a baseball, exploded with tremendous heat and energy, sending force fields and particles in an expanding outward arc, which over time, with cooling and coalescing of particles, formed the universe as we now know it. And this universe continues even now to expand at a rapid rate, growing ever larger and moving further and further outward as a result, continuing result of what occurred 13.7 billion years ago. Now, this in itself is quite a mystical idea, is it not? There was a time when some of us thought that science was a very simple, rational discipline. 2 + 2 = 4. 2 particles of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen create water, and so forth. I doubt that serious scientists ever thought of science as being that simple. But today we certainly know that it is not that simple. And due to modern physics, the great divide between rational science and mystical religion has all but disappeared. It's no coincidence that many quantum physicists today consider themselves to be very religious people. Very unusual how we tend to think of scientists being anti-religious. But back to the Big Bang. What we consider empty space is anything but empty. Space, both on Earth and in outer space, is filled with radically active subatomic particles which came into being with the Big Bang. These particles, which are constantly materializing and dissolving, can be as small as 1/billionth of 1/billionth of 1/billionth of a centimeter. And we can't comprehend that. But collectively, these particles make up the vast majority of form and weight in the universe. 70% of the weight of the universe is made up of these invisible, seemingly invisible, subatomic particles, which have not coalesced into any recognizable shape or form. Only 30% of the weight of the universe is comprised of planets and stars. And the movement of these subatomic particles, which are constantly moving in any which direction, seemingly without any order, toward the expansion of the universe, with the help of force fields such as gravity, the one we know best, but is only one of several force fields, these constantly moving subatomic particles hold together what we consider to be matter. This city, this temple, this lectern, this body that I call me are held together in their shape by the constant barrage of subatomic particles which cause the molecules that make up matter to coalesce into recognizable shapes or forms and to continue to exist in those forms. And according to the physicists, if the movement toward expansion continues indefinitely, then at some point, perhaps some several billion years in the future, all matter as we now know it will explode, or more accurately, implode, from the force of this constant expansion. But how do physicists know this? Because with the help of colliders, these huge machines, miles long, through which they study the movement of individual atoms and particles, like the one in CERN, Switzerland, and with the help of other scientific tools which are too complex for me to begin to understand or describe, the effects of subatomic particles have been measured and observed since early in the 20th century. Now, one very simple experiment which Green describes demonstrated the presence of these expanding subatomic particles. In a vacuum, they took two thin metal sheets, and they were placed very close to each other, leaving just a distance equal to the thickness of one sheet of paper between them. And the physicists who devised this experiment hypothesized that if there are countless subatomic particles in the air bombarding and exerting pressure on all objects, it would stand that the particles that are coming from the outside against these two sheets of metal would exert a lot more force and pressure than the ones that could move only within the limited space between them, which was the thickness of one sheet of paper. And therefore, over a period of time, these two sheets of metal would be pushed together by these particles until they were touching, leaving no space between them. And that is exactly what happened. Amazing. Now, who apart from these brilliant physicists would have thought that these uncountable, unviewable, with our eyes, subatomic particles and force fields were so active and virtually filling what appears to be empty space? Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Suddenly those words don't seem quite so strange, though the thought still staggers the mind and resists any easy comprehension. And this is only one of many startling facts that Green talks about in his broadcast and in his book, which I highly recommend. There are many others that are equally mind-blowing, and I do not use that term easily or frivolously, because I think these insights do tend to stretch our minds to their full capacity and beyond. I found myself my mind kind of swimming after watching each of these episodes. The second of the 4 segments of the fabric of the cosmos was entitled The Illusion of Time. I'm not going to go into great detail here about that, except to say that many of the things we take for granted about time may just not be true. For example, the assumption that time is something that is perfectly measurable and constantly moving forward in one direction, which we describe in terms of past, present, and future. Were you aware that time is altered by movement? I wasn't. If you and I are sitting facing each other and our watches are synchronized to the millionth of a second, if we had a watch that could do that, they would continue to be in perfect synchronization so long as neither of us moves. But if I move a few yards toward you, then as a result of my movement, my watch will then be a few millionths of a second faster than yours. And this has been demonstrated using atomic clocks and jets traveling around the world. We don't notice this effect because it's a question of millionths of a second, which we would never notice. But if we were facing each other from 2 planets that were separated by several light years of distance, and we synchronized our watches, and I then just moved a few meters while you remained still, 10 or more years would have passed for me than for you, because the greater distance magnifies the effect of movement on time. And if after moving, I were able somehow to see on a screen what you were doing at that precise moment, I would be, after my movement, I would be seeing you 10 years in the future. 10 years that you presumably haven't lived yet. Extraordinary, isn't it? Nothing is what it appears to be. The 4th segment of the fabric of the cosmos is called Universe or Multiverse. Green and many of his colleagues suggest that the universe we know, which we think comprises everything, may just be one of an infinite number of universes. They suggest that new big bangs are occurring every moment, creating other universes. And since this would appear to be a constant and infinite process, they surmise that everything we experience here on this earth is being replicated somewhere else on a planet in one of these other infinite universes. Somewhere in the multiverse, according to this theory, there is someone named Kim Jones giving this precise dharma talk to a group that is exactly like you, in a building precisely like this, at this moment, and maybe in every moment in one of these infinite universes. Now, the things that Green discusses, the idea of the multiverse is the least verifiable, excuse me, but he suggests that one day the tools will exist to verify the fact that we are not the only universe. It gets stranger and stranger. Now, as fascinating as the episodes on space and on time and on multiverses are, for our purposes, the one that I found most interesting and which most closely mirrors what Buddhism teaches is the 3rd episode, which is called Quantum Leap, and is about quantum mechanics. In studying atoms and subatomic particles, quantum physicists have discovered that many atoms or subatomic particles, like electrons or photons, act together as pairs, and they call that entanglement. Each particle in such an entangled pair moves in concert exactly with the movements and behavior of its twin. And this has been observed thousands of times. And it's been demonstrated scientifically. Using observatories on 2 different islands in the Canary Islands, physicists separated electrons that were paired in this way, that were entangled, placing one of each pair in a container on one island and its twin electron on another island. What they observed was that if they caused one of a pair to move by spinning or moving it in any direction, its twin electron on the other island moved or spun in exactly the same way at exactly the same speed and the same moment. And it would appear that even if one of each pair were placed on the moon, or even on a distant planet, that exact replication of movement would occur. Even more amazingly, they discovered that if they attached another particle, like a photon, to one of the entangled electrons, and then with a laser beamed a representation of that photon to the twin electron on the other island, the photon would dematerialize on this island and rematerialize and appear connected to the electron on the other island, without ever having physically crossed the water between those two islands. And this raises the question as to the possibility that someday whole objects, or even human beings, could be literally beamed from one location to another, dematerializing in the first location and rematerializing in the second by virtue of being attached to a multitude of entangled particles. Beam me up, Scotty. How can we account for this? It certainly is not due to the force of gravity given the distances between the two particles or groups of entangled particles. There's no way to explain this concept of entanglement, and it remains one of the great unexplained mysteries for quantum physicists. But it has interesting implications for Buddhist teaching and practice. There's a Buddhist saying that when a leaf falls in Tokyo, the ground trembles in Hong Kong. Now, this has usually been understood as a kind of metaphor. But is it only metaphor? Or is there some literal truth to this? We talk of how karma can spread like the ripples in a stream. If I show goodwill toward you, and you then show that same goodwill toward someone else, who then in turn repeats it with someone else, the circle of goodwill that is generated from my good karma spreads exponentially. And I've always found this to be a very hopeful and a very positive thought. But in light of what quantum physicists are describing when they talk about entangled particles, karma may actually spread far beyond those who have directly been touched by it. In some way that we do not understand, there may be people out there, or for that matter, other sentient beings, including plants or animals, that in an entangled way reverberate with my movements and actions, and others that may reverberate with yours, much like the entangled subatomic particles. We'll never know if this is actually true, but somehow it feels right. And as mystical an idea as it is, it's not inconsistent with the theories of quantum physics. If it works on a micro level, who is to say that it doesn't also work on a macro level? Now, all of this seems so far-fetched and so contrary to our rational, logical way of viewing the world and all that we know within it, that I think it can be a very frightening kind of thought. If space is not the empty vessel that we think it is, if time does not follow the simple laws and patterns of past, present, and future that we think it does, if our universe is not unique, and maybe even you and I are not unique in a multiverse, and if subatomic particles, and just maybe even larger entities, are bound together by some force or energy that we can't begin to understand, then what is real? And what is reality? Can we count on our five senses and what they tell us if nothing is exactly as it appears to be? Or are we hopelessly lost in a series of delusions about what reality is? This is a frightening thought. But Green and other physicists would reassure us about this. If on a micro scale there appears to be chaos in the random movement of subatomic particles as the universe expands, and if on an infinite scale time takes on strange characteristics and infinite universes coexist in a way that we can't begin to understand, nevertheless on a macro scale, in this world in which we live, this earth at this moment, there is a continuity of reality that we all experience with a large amount of consensual validation. When I walk out of this building this afternoon, I will find the same 57th Street out there that I saw this morning. and you will see it too, and we will agree essentially on what it looks like. And we can depend on the fact that the sun will set tonight and will rise tomorrow, as it has for millions of years and presumably will for millions more. There is a level of reality in which we move and live that is not suddenly going to disappear or change dramatically. And yes, we can depend on our perception to the extent that our limited brains permit that what we see, hear, taste, smell, and touch is consistent and will remain real to us for the foreseeable future. And this very fact is one of the holes, actually, in quantum theory. And quantum physicists are challenged by the apparent discrepancy between what occurs on the micro subatomic level and what occurs on the macro level, which we observed. Why are things so chaotic on the micro level and yet apparently so ordered and predictable on the level we observe? They don't yet have an answer for that. At the same time, we are challenged by the concept, which I think that physicists have demonstrated pretty conclusively as knowledge, that ultimately, beyond the parameters of our limited brains and human understanding, nothing is exactly as it appears to be. And the more we learn about the tiny subatomic realm and the infinitely large multiverse realm, which exceeds our ability to comprehend or even to imagine, the more overwhelmed we are and the more awestruck. And I would suggest that this is essentially a positive thing for several reasons. First, it helps us to see ourselves with more humility and less grandiosity. How small we are in this great universe, or perhaps multiverse. How limited our ability to grasp all of, or even a small portion of, reality. Secondly, I think it's good because it shows us that the word transcendence, which is so central to spirituality and to every major religion, is not just some diluted or cockeyed concept. Whether you understand transcendence as God, Yahweh, Allah, or a higher power, or as karma and the manifestations of karmic reality, or simply as the wonders and mysteries of nature, including the depth and breadth of the human brain and the human soul, however we may understand transcendence, modern physics has substantiated that there is so much more in the universe, or the multiverse, than what the human ego can value and what the human brain can imagine. And that is the very definition of transcendence, because it transcends our normal experience and comprehension. No wonder that many quantum physicists see themselves as spiritual, religious people. Finally, in a world where nothing is exactly as it appears, the corollary to this is that then anything is possible. Do we really have any idea of what are the limits of the human mind, which we have only begun to plumb the depths of that? Can we even begin to conceive of just how the positive karmic energy that we are capable of exuding can influence others and possibly affect or even change the world? In a time when the world economy is on the verge of self-destruction, when politics are driven by greed to the point of absurdity, and the environment is suffering irreparable harm from human stupidity, it is very easy to be cynical and to feel that nothing can be done to turn things around. What can I do? We live in a time when we have to be very, very careful not to be swept away by pessimism and cynicism. What I carry away from the insights offered by Brian Greene in The Fabric of the Cosmos, having learned just a bit about the incredible, limitless complexity of the universe or multiverse, is that ultimately in this world where nothing is exactly as it appears to be, anything is possible. And you and I, so long as we maintain our spiritual practice, and so long as we do all that we can to be positive influences in the small sphere in which we live and move and have our being, we can make a difference. And maybe a far greater difference than we ever imagined. It's not necessarily a reason for pride, but it's definitely a reason for hope. Thank you.